Hi, I'm Paul Franco, an assistant teaching professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Washington in Seattle. And in this video, I'm going to give you an overview of my paper, Ordinary Language Philosophy and the Historical Turn in Philosophy of Science. This is a paper in the history of history and philosophy of science. Following the conventions established by our friends in Hopos, I'm coining this new field Ho-Haps. My paper situates the historical turn in philosophy of science in its larger philosophical context. It's part of a larger research project in which I've been looking at methodological debates in analytic philosophy between philosophers of language and philosophers of science. I'm hoping to get a clearer sense of the place of philosophy of science in analytic philosophy, as well as fill out our understanding of the move away from logical positivism in philosophy of science. In this paper, I take some cues from remarks that Thomas Kuhn made in his presidential address to the 1990 meeting of the Philosophy of Science Association. In that address, Kuhn talks about the historical turn in philosophy of science. He says, quote, "That's a transition for which I get far more credit and also more blame than I have coming to me. I was, if you will, present at the creation, and it wasn't very crowded. But others were present too, Paul Feyerabend and Russ Hansen in particular, as well as Mary Hesse, Michael Polanyi, Stephen Toulmin, and a few more besides. Whatever a zeitgeist is, we provided a striking illustration of its role in intellectual affairs." So my paper specifically looks at the time period between Quine's two dogmas appearing in 1951 and Kuhn's structure coming out in 1962. What's happening in this period? Well, first, ordinary language philosophy was at the peak of its influence. So at the same time the historical turn was taking shape, a different shift was happening in analytic philosophy. This shift was away from ideal language analysis and towards ordinary language analysis. During this time, Hempel and Oppenheim's deductive nomological model of explanation came under intense scrutiny, especially from a group of philosophers of science interested in the pragmatic aspects of explanation, as well as from those interested in non-deductive forms of reasoning in science, like analogical reasoning. Finally, while I don't take up these points in my paper, it's worth noting that a lot of institutional groundwork for HBS programs was being laid by Stephen Toulmin at Leeds, for example, Russ Hansen at Indiana, and Hesse at Cambridge. And the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science was also established at this time. And indeed, much of the debate about explanation unfolded in the early volumes of the Minnesota Studies in the Philosophy of Science at the time. So in my paper, I connect these different strands by situating the historical turn in philosophy of science in relation to ordinary language philosophy style criticisms of the DN model of explanation. As Wesley Salmon says, the original article in which Hempel and Oppenheim lay out the DN model is an outstanding example of the use of an artificial formal language for purposes of explicating a fundamental scientific concept, end quote. And so it was an obvious target for philosophers of science influenced by ordinary language philosophy. The DN model leaves out exactly those pragmatic elements of explanation an ordinary language philosopher would want to emphasize. Moreover, insofar as the methodology of ordinary language philosophy suggests close examination of concrete cases of explanation, history ends up offering a wealth of examples of different explanations that were offered. So I focus particularly on philosophers of science, educated and/or teaching in the British philosophical context during the 1950s. Specifically, I look at Toulmin and Michael Scriven, two philosophers explicitly adopting approaches to scientific explanation influenced by ordinary language philosophy. Toulmin's 1953 Philosophy of Science, his 1961 Foresight and Understanding, and Scriven's contributions to the early volumes of Minnesota Studies all show skepticism about the ability of formal approaches to reveal something illuminating about scientific explanation and how it actually plays out in scientific practice. In another part of the paper, I look at Hesse's criticisms of the DN model. Her approach isn't as explicitly influenced by ordinary language philosophy as is Toulmin's and Scriven's. Both Hesse and Toulmin, though, draw upon historical case studies to drive their points about explanation home. Moreover, like Toulmin and Scriven, she appeals to the work of Friedrich Waismann, who moved in both logical positivist and ordinary language philosophy circles. Right now, I bracket the work of the other folks Kuhn mentions as present at the start of the historical turn. A fuller sketch would look at Hansen, who thanks Strawson in his 1958 Patterns of Discovery, and Feyerabend, whose 1962 Explanation, Reduction, and Empiricism was published in the third volume of Minnesota Studies in Philosophy of Science. That said, Vaso-Kindi has written a recent piece looking at Wittgenstein's influence on Toulmin, Hansen, and Feyerabend and the historical turn as well. And it's also important to note that the contributions of Toulmin, Scriven, and especially Hesse go beyond the small part of history that I'm sketching here. They make interesting claims that go beyond any sort of connection they might have to ordinary language philosophy, of course. I'm just interested in telling that story in this paper. So besides a general skepticism about artificial language analysis, what are the features of Scriven's and Toulmin's criticisms of the DN model? First, both point out a connection between understanding and explanation. Explanation aims to increase understanding, and its success is a contextual matter. Our analysis of particular acts of explaining need to look at the audience requesting an explanation, and especially the audience's interest and their level of knowledge. This relates to their second criticism. Both Scriven and Toulmin reject the DN model's proposed symmetry between prediction and explanation. Predictions don't necessarily increase understanding, but explanations do. Scriven says that, for example, cows laying down in the field allow us to predict it will rain, but that doesn't increase our understanding in any sort of way. And furthermore, both Scriven and Toulmin make this point. Some explanations that increase understanding, like evolutionary theory, fail to make any sort of predictions at all. The third criticism has to do with their view of how laws of nature figure in explanatory reasoning. Both Scriven and Toulmin reject that their purpose is to serve as generalizations that cover particular circumstances. Instead, laws of nature supply what Toulmin calls explanatory paradigms, and he fleshes out the ways in which these explanatory paradigms provide a pattern of explanation that tells us what needs explaining and how to go about explaining it. And both also reject that laws of nature are true or false in any straightforward sense. Hesse's criticisms don't explicitly adopt ordinary language style argumentative strategies like Scriven and Toulmin do. However, she does pay close attention to history and concrete cases of explanatory reasoning. Her criticisms of the deductive nomological model turn on the central role that she sees models playing in explanation. She argues that scientists do not consider the mathematical part of their theories, quote, as if it were purely formal and uninterpreted. Instead, they will use language about entities such as quanta of radiation, scattering, tracks of photoelectrons, and so on. In other words, they still persist in talking of models, end quote. For Hesse, this is a central part of scientific practice that needs to be accounted for. Models for Hesse set standards of intelligibility and make theories testable. According to Hesse, theories must have open texture, in Weissmann's phrase, and here I'm quoting Hesse, that is, a fringe of meaning not defined by observation. Otherwise, the whole meaning of the theory would change whenever it was desired to incorporate into it observations of a novel kind, end quote. Models exhibit the right sort of open texture. Hesse says, quote, the reason why a model such as that implied in, for example, the dynamical theory of gases is not just a dispensable way of picturing the appropriate equations, is that the model can be generalized, extended, and tested, and if necessary, modified as a purely formal deductive system cannot, end quote. In light of the role that she assigns models, Hesse downplays the sort of deductive reasoning in the deductive nomological model of explanation in favor of looking at analogical reasoning between the model and the phenomena that it's supposed to be helping us understand. So, on the views of explanation on offer across the work of Scriven, Toulmin, and Hesse, while truth or falsity is relevant to the correctness or accuracy of an explanation, the importance of context, judgment, and understanding are left out by the DN model. In downplaying truth and deductive argument and emphasizing context, judgment, and understanding, historical examples of explanation might start to seem more interesting. Explanations in the history of science, insofar as they are relative to the state of knowledge and interests of the persons giving and receiving explanations, are related to explanatory paradigms or models. And history shows that such paradigms or models shift over time. While we know past scientific explanations did not always feature true explanans, and they didn't always take the form of deductive arguments, we can assess those explanations within their own context and see what sort of understanding they afforded and what sort of patterns of explanations they employed. Moreover, looking at past scientific explanations is also a way of putting into practice what Scriven calls context analysis and the method of comparison. That's another idea that they take from Friedrich Waismann. By examining scientific explanations in their historical context and comparing cases in which the participants involved took themselves to offer explanations, we can learn more about scientific explanation and our current characterizations of it. Importantly, Toulmin also argues that looking at the history of our concepts seems to be a natural extension of ordinary language methodology. Toulmin argues that the ordinary language methods adopted by the later Wittgenstein and Waismann, quote, open to inquiry a whole range of empirical and historical questions more radical and exciting than anyone immediately recognized, end quote. However, the ordinary language philosopher did not take up these questions. Instead, they focused on imagined language games, contrived thought experiments, or sources like case law. Despite this, the methods of the ordinary language philosopher, according to Toulmin, nonetheless prompted us to consider how our conceptual arrangements are bound up with our forms of life. They also help reveal how these forms of life and the conceptual arrangements we currently have could have been different. Toulmin says the later Wittgenstein's little stories are designed such that the audience is, quote, compelled to concede that the applicability or inapplicability of our actual categories and concepts depends, in practice, always on previous human decisions, and that these decisions have become second nature to us, end quote. Toulmin asks, why not go further? Rather than merely speculating about how our concepts ended up in their current relationships, or thinking through imagined scenarios to reveal the current shape of conceptual arrangements, Toulmin wonders, quote, why should we not try to base our understanding on a wider study of how things in fact have happened? To borrow from the title of his paper, Toulmin suggests philosophers of science undertake conceptual history. When we do this, we see our current concepts and their relationships are, quote, not unchangeable verities, but intellectual equilibria, end quote. Looking at the intellectual equilibria of different time periods draws attention to the shape of our current conceptual arrangements and the rules, habits, and conventions underlying them, as well as to how these arrangements are and might have been different. Connecting this back to criticisms of the DN model of explanation, I think such a history might make more sense once one gives up the idea that genuine scientific explanations have to be true, have to be predictive, and have to make use of scientific laws within a particular deductive argument form. Looking to the history of science shows the ways the state of knowledge, understanding, and forms of life at the time shape attempts to work out explanatory paradigms embodied in ideals of natural order, laws of nature, and models. So what's the upshot to this history I sketched? I think there are two. First, it fills out the details of the move away from logical positivism to more historical and practice-focused philosophies of science during the 50s and 60s. The DN model of explanation was the central site of debate for philosophers of science, and the sustained criticisms of it deserve as much attention in our histories of history and philosophy of science as do Quine's two dogmas and Kuhn's structure. Second, questions about linguistic meaning and the proper targets and aims of philosophical analysis are part and parcel of the historical turn and its reception. Consider, for example, debates about semantic incommensurability and the proper targets of philosophical analysis. Looking beyond Wittgenstein and at the larger philosophical background of the time, during which ordinary language philosophers had a hand in bringing these questions to prominence, helps us understand the centrality of questions about meaning and the proper targets of analysis in philosophy of science during the 50s and 60s. Before I'll end, I'll leave you with some brief recommendations of some HBS scholars who make similar connections. Ian Hacking often refers to J.L. Austin throughout his work and ties ordinary language methodology to conceptual history. Basso Kindi has great work linking Kuhn and Stanley Cavell. And Ha-Seok Chang has recently drawn upon the work of Scriven and Austin, among others. And if you want to know a little bit more about the history I've sketched, I'll humbly suggest a 2018 paper in Hopos by me, which is a prequel to this current research project. So thanks for watching this video.